What's up, guys? Rick Casali here in the studio, bringing you that weekly art video. And today's discussion will be the planes of the head. And there's a lot of different categories when you talk about portraiture. As I mentioned in my previous videos on the figure, you have the anatomy, but then the ways we organize the anatomy in an artistic sense is establishing the pose, the action, right? In this case, a seated or standing portrait is a vertical. It has a few diagonal axes to the portrait that we've talked about in the previous figurative videos. You have the proportional sense of the anatomy. So we mentioned the halfway point on the figure. The halfway point on the skull will be the inside corner of the eye, generally speaking. Okay, so from the chin to the very top of the head, the halfway point will be the inside corner of the eyes. Inside corner of the eyes are generally a little bit lower than the outside corner, although there are exceptions. Some people have the opposite. So you have the pose, in other words, the direction of the figure. You have the proportions of the figure. You have the organic rhythms, and I discussed, long linear organic rhythms. You can look at the teachings of Frank Riley for that. Maybe from the back of the head flowing into the chest. That's a good organic rhythm, linear rhythm. You could also go. What's another good one? You could go from maybe this downward plane of the nasal eminence. See how that relates to the front of the neck. That's a good relationship. And there's others, and you can discover your own as you study. So that's rhythms. And then the final, and I think the most vital way to organize gross anatomy is the geometry. So again, these are all different systems you need to have in your toolbox to make a successful portrait or figure. These are systems to organize gross anatomy. And again, gross anatomy is the muscles, the bones, the tendons, the ligaments, the fat pads, the glands, all those fancy things that people want to dive into, right? I mean, one of the main distractions with the portrait is the eyes, and that's natural, because when we look at somebody, we have to look at their face, and then we look into their eyes. So it's normal that you would focus on the eyeball, but let's try to think about the eyeball as not the focus, but as, in a structural sense, it's kind of the cherry on top. It's a jewel amongst a landscape of beautiful, coordinated, solid form, okay? Because you can have a beautiful eye, but if the eyes are out of whack, or, one's deeper than the other, or they're not related side to side in an organic figure eight, what's the point? Then you're just a Picasso. So, you could argue that a lot of the 20th century isms, which Picasso was a part of, those were simply artists that, they were sort of swept up in the times, and they were celebrated for their failures, for their bad habits. So if Picasso tended to make things wonky, oh, that's his style. If Zygomatic made things really tall and skinny, well, that was just his style. So he became famous for that. Now that worked in the 20th century. I don't think it flies anymore, to be honest. So you have to look at which isms stand the test of time, and I think it'll be interesting to look back on the 20th century. All right, not to get off on a tangent, let's get back to the matter at hand, the geometry of the head. So I think the best book for this, I'll just say right up front, is The Human Figure by John Vanderpool. He just really has all the geometry for the figure. He has the geometry for the limbs, the arms and legs, and also the geometry for the head. Now, you can see over here on the left a very small geometric drawing. And it's a shame they're so small. So what I would do is take this image, scan it, blow it up, and really study that. You can even shade in the planes. So he has this nice diamond cut head, and there are some other examples in here. Here's another one. This is a drawing he did of his daughter. Very beautiful drawing. Or maybe that's his wife. I'll have to check. I think it's his daughter. Here's another one. You can see that sort of cutting the head like a diamond into these triangular and trapezoidal planes. So I've attempted to do my own version here, and I think you can learn something from every artist. There's not just one way to break it down, but you'll notice there are universal planes that show up again and again and again, whether it be the Greeks, whether it be Michelangelo, whether it be Bernini, you get into Rodin and Degas. They're all using kind of the same system, just manifested in slightly different ways. There'll be little variations, but generally speaking, they're all part of that that brotherhood or sisterhood of artists, where they're standing on the shoulders of who came before them. And I think that's one of the exciting things about being an artist, is it connects you to the past. And different types of heads are going to reveal themselves differently. They're going to reveal different parts of the geometric system. So without going into history too much, let's just address some of these major planes concerning the geometry of the head. So a lot of art books will make the head into an egg shape, and I think the egg is probably the best summary of the head. It's an egg in the sense that we have a very big brain, right? Big brain case, cranial mass, and then we have a very narrow chin. So the unique thing about being human, among other things, is that our brains are big and advanced, complex. We have this great power to reason. But then our faces are not really for hunting and killing things. Our faces are sort of delicate and beautiful, and they serve as basically a communication center. And the reason I bring up, other mammals is because if you look at maybe the skull of a bear or a deer or a tiger, you'll see they have a smaller brain and they have an enormous muzzle, right? A killing mechanism. So I think comparative anatomy with animals is interesting and worth doing, because what it does is it really shows the essence of what we are, and that is a flaring egg. Chicken egg, right? A bird egg. We're a bird egg in the sense that we taper to the chin. Not a human egg, which is round, but a bird egg turned up on its end. So when you look at the skull too, here's a pretty good plastic skull. You can see that flare from the chin to the cheekbones up to the parietal eminence. The parietal eminence is the widest part of the head, way up here. So it's that parietal process on the parietal bones, the high point of the parietal bone. So I think the egg is good. You can also equate the head to a block. And George Bridgman, in his books, he's very good at doing that. He makes the head into a block. I think the block is also a good way to think about it. However, we're not strictly a block with right angles. You know, for instance, this edge is not a right angle. It's more obtuse than that. It's more opened up. But the good thing about a block is it makes you define 6 planes. Remember, a cube has 6 sides: a front, a top, 2 deep sides, a back, and then an underneath plane. And I think that underneath plane is probably the most ignored. Maybe the back of the head too. So maybe I'll touch on that today. So in the theme of the block, in the spirit of the block, you're going to want to divide the top from the side. And you can see it on the skull. It's going to happen along this landmark here, which is called the temporal ridge. This is the temporal ridge. It's where your temporalis muscle is going to be attaching, you know, to that corner. And if you equate the head to a house, this is the rooftop, like a dome or a gable roof. You can see on him it's more like a peak. If this is a house, this is the roof, this is the side, this is the facade. Your temporal ridge is like the gutters of the house. So that starts to divide the top from the side. And even in a portrait where you have a lot of hair, I'm thinking of the pearl earring, girl with the pearl earring by Vermeer. She's wearing a turban, but you still see the light and shade breaking on that temporal ridge. So again, these things are timeless and universal, and it's important to know them, especially when things are subtle or obscured by hair or drapery. Because what you want to do is turn that obscurity, is that a word? That hair or drapery into not a hider of form, but into an accentuator of form. So a lot of contemporary artists, they think, oh, someone's got a beard, or they got a bunch of hair, or a bunch of drapery, or the sand and waves at the feet. Well, that's a good way to hide the anatomy. I don't have to deal with the form. Well, I would challenge that and say, instead of thinking that way, think, how does this beard reveal the form underneath? Next week I'm going to be doing a portrait sculpture of Michael Shane Neal, the great portrait painter in Nashville, and you can still get tickets for that. Just go to my Instagram page, and he has a beard, so I'm going to be confronted with that challenge of I've done it before, but it's never easy having a beard on top of the geometry, and how does that accentuate the planes? So don't think of those things as things that hide the anatomy. Think of them as things that accentuate what's underneath. Because, like I said in the previous video, the skeleton is the great dictator of all the anatomy. It's the superstructure. It's the framework. And a head is nearly all skull. I mean, you have some muscles and fat on the face, but essentially, a lot of your head is your skull coming to the surface, especially in your forehead, your eye sockets, your nasal bone, cheekbones, your teeth, right? Your teeth are a part of your skeleton. And, when people get orthodontia, it affects their profile. That's something that they'll always show. Oh, look how we're going to change your profile. So don't neglect the teeth. Sometimes when I can't understand someone's mouth, I will request that they show me their teeth, and I'll check out the teeth. Okay, so we have a division between top and side, also a division between front and side. So this division between front and side will essentially go down that temporal ridge imaginarily down the Zygomaticus Major and then swings into the chin. So I've got some little ins and outs for the eye socket already, but when I start ahead, I might just make this one simple plane versus this plane. Maybe omit the nose in the beginning. So again, for clarity, you're going to swing up around the back of the cranial mass, along the temporal ridge, turn a little more vertically, and then go into this Zygomaticus Major, which in a visual sense unites with the triangularis muscle and then swings into the side of that chin bone. So you'll see that a lot. You'll see this kind of classic division between front and side on a lot of your paintings and sculptures. And I'll draw some lines today to help illustrate it. I hope it's clear on the video. But ultimately, you want the planes to tell the story. You want the planes to do the talking, not the line between the planes. So the challenge is, if you blur the line, is the plane still there? That's a good question. So my teacher's teacher, Henry Henchy, would always say every form change is a color change. And you can debate that. There are different schools of painting, but another way to say it is every form change could be a value shift. So again, the top of the head's brighter than the side of the head. This is the light. This is going into a halftone, and eventually you go into the chin, and that's a shadow. So every form change is a color change. So you have that temporal ridge swinging into the chin. That's going to divide front from side. And then you'll also have a break between the front and the top of the head. And I'm going to outline it again, because it's something that can be very kind of slurred here. There's not like an edge necessarily here on this plane, but there will be a good turning edge here at the top of what's called the frontal eminences. So instead of obsessing about this edge, I would be more, put more emphasis on this being the frontal plane of that forehead, because this is more of a corner than this. This is kind of sliding in, and you can get a skull for yourself to understand the frontal eminences and the nasal eminences and how they equate to this quadrant on the front of the forehead. So these are the frontal eminences, these are the nasal eminences, and together they make that trapezoid box. That's the true front of the face. These two little planes are sliding off. So think of these not as front or side, but kind of in between planes. And when you're doing a painting or sculpture, you'll oftentimes notice that these are in a half tone. They're sliding off into the dark, whereas this will be real crisp and shiny. Here you have a sort of bird-like shape, triangular plane on the bottom of the nasal eminence. So always observe that half tone. Could be a shadow if the light's way above. And observe how the tail end of this nasal eminence is going to ride up and over this little piece down here. So you have what we get into, which is called wedging, or dovetailing of form, where one form is sneaking under another, and they're sort of passing each other. And that's how natural form works. It doesn't just butt up against each other. It instead interlocks with one another. Okay, so that's another concept for you called wedging. When you get into modeling three-dimensional form that is coordinated, you'll have to address how the parts fit together. How does the cheek fit into the jaw section? Okay, so that's a brief overview of the forehead. You can see how the nasal bone is locked right up into that nasal eminence, and I'll leave the nose alone for now. Let's get into the facial planes. This is probably what people really want. So again, the main one is that temporal ridge sliding into the Zygomaticus major, triangularis sliding into the chin. Now you come over to the side of the head, you'll have what's called the Zygomatic Arch, which is the widest part of the face. Remember, this is the face, this is the whole head. Widest part of the head's up here, so don't confuse the two. That's Parietal Eminence. This is the Zygomatic Arch. The widest part of the face will be the Zygomatic Arch towards the back. So you want to follow this getting wider and wider and wider. And then right there, you can feel on yourself, before you hit the sideburn, it'll be the widest, and then it's going to dip in towards your ear canal. So you can feel it on yourself. Right behind your sideburn, it's going to dip in. That's the widest part of the whole face. So that zygomatic arch, or cheekbone, is important because it adds to the flare of the face. You don't want a boxy, round face, like a circle or a box. You want a triangulated face that's more like a trapezoid. So the cheekbones add to the flare of the face. The ears add to the flare of the face. And the parietal eminence really add to the flare of the whole head as it goes up towards that big brain. So remember, little tiny face, chin, big brain. You can think of this whole thing as a cone. My teacher, Cedric Egley, always described this as a cone coming down, maybe a cone coming up to this point. He's very into geometry, thankfully. So another plane we can add, you know, the zygomatic arch will have that top plane. The orbit of the eye will cut back for that peripheral vision. So you get a little bit of interruption to this plane. So that's why you have to use your imagination. You have to see how it connects to the chin. And then you'll have a top plane to the zygomatic. Let's call this Z, zygomatic 1. You have a downward plane, which is trapezoidal, Z2. I'm just making up these names. You can make up your own. And then come to the front, you could call this Z3. You know, it's like the frontal plane of the zygomatic. Then you'll have a little top plane. This could be 4. See that little like boomerang shaped top plane? Okay, this is all housing for the eyeball. So it's not so much the eyeball as it is sculpting all this form around the eyeball. Here's that outer edge of the orbit. I'm sure there's a name for that. You sort of have this is a confusing little area. You have this little flange, kind of like a buttress coming up to meet that corner. So this will go from our vertical, and then it'll turn under, where this downward plane where the lacrimal gland is. So this is a very rich, convex, triangular plane, and then you'll get a lot of depth, and maybe you could argue concavity here. There's a couple more little intricacies there to the eye socket, but I want to stick to the bigger planes on this video. But you can see how that zygomatic arch is very important to the width of the face. And then coming off the bottom of the zygomatic arch, you have what's called the Masseter Muscle. So I'll put an M here for Masseter. Okay? That's like, you could think of that as a chewing muscle running from your zygomatic to your mandible to the jaw. So we could think of this in zones here. This is the temple, T. This is the masseter. And then look what's created here. Between the front plane and the masseter, you have this little in-between plane. I'll call this I for in-between. TMI. Too much. This could also be an in-between plane. Because the reason I'm calling them in-between or corner planes is because they don't face to the front of the side, they face to the corners. So maybe it's better to call them corner planes, but TMI is kind of funny, so there's TMI. The front of this eye socket will separate from the cheek form coming down. And again, this cheek form gets a lot of attention. Usually a beginning art student will just focus on that. So instead of focusing on that, what I really want you to do is focus on this plane more. And I pulled out my Degas book. I love Degas' sculptures. I know he's a painter mostly, but great sculptor. And it's really clear on this little ballerina, this dancer figure, that there is a clear distinction between the top of the head being shiny and then the smoky underplane along that zygomatic flowing into the upper lip. And my teacher Cedric Egley always called this the equator of the head, in the sense that your head divides into two hemispheres. There's an upper hemisphere that faces up and a downward hemisphere that faces down into the dark. So what I'm talking about is this. And this is something you can carry all the way to the back of the head. So that little edge there, I drew a line just to make it clear. This is going to follow the Zygomaticus Minor muscle. And I think this plane gets ignored a lot. That's why I'm going to emphasize it. I'm going to try to emphasize things that I think need to be fixed out in the world there. So you have the Zygomaticus Minor muscle breaking the top from the bottom. So on a lot of portraits you'll notice everything south of that Zygomaticus Minor will be going into a halftone or a shadow, going under into the dark. And I think in this Vanderpool book, you know, he's got this drawing here, really beautiful head. You can see see from her cheekbones under, you're getting a smokier world down there. And you can definitely see it on his description of the planes. So from the cheekbone, you have a little system of planes that radiate. You have the cheekbone to the front of the masseter, the cheekbone to the front to the Zygomaticus Major, Triangularis combo. And then you have the cheekbone to the upper lip, which is Zygomaticus Minor. So the net result of that will be like a shinier little accent, right under the nose, the top of the teeth. And then the whole eye socket cheekbone region will be a little brighter and snappier. And this will be softer and warmer and deeper in color. I think what confuses people is that the chin and the lips kind of pop out a little bit. So they'll tend to make the mouth come forward too much, whereas this whole plane is going back. So remember, the upper teeth, generally speaking, are in front of the lower teeth. So from the philtrum, this is the philtrum, this little divot above your upper lip going into the nose. You can look at Vanderpool for this. This is going to create the front plane of the mouth. And it basically goes from the philtrum through the peaks of the upper lip, through the width of the lower lip. And then imaginarily you have to go, again, use your imagination, out to the width of the chin, the front plane of the chin. This is going to make sort of you can look in his book, but it makes like a little triangle front plane. And that's sort of that's the real front of the face. Again, this quadrant of the frontal eminence, nasal eminence, the front plane of the nose, and then this little triangular front plane of the mouth, getting wider as it goes down. Everything from this ridge will start to break away and go back and away from the front of the face, or down and under, away from the Zygomaticus Minor muscle. So my teacher, Cedric Egley, called this the keel of the face. You know, we live in Maryland, so we're on the Chesapeake Bay. There's a lot of boats. And, you know, talk about boat building is not unusual, and his father built boats. So he always talked about this is the keel of the face. You don't know what a keel is on a boat. It's the bottom, the weighted piece on the bottom of the boat that keeps the boat from tipping over. There's that big piece that comes off. So, again, this is the keel of the face. And sort of ignore this little cheek, fleshy cheek form for a second in service to this grander equator of the head that breaks the northern hemisphere from the southern hemisphere. And again, you can follow it all the way back, the zygomatic, and then up into this parietal eminence. So, and there's more to it than that, but I thought that'd be a good introduction. You can't learn all this from a video, but you can learn a lot from a video. I learned from watching old VHS tapes of my teachers teach. And but there's no substitute for putting in the hours yourself, attending workshops, and getting your hands into the clay to really understand these geometric planes and their orientation in space. So I'm teaching some figure workshops this January here in Maryland and also in Tampa, Florida. I'll teach my my portrait workshop every August here at my private studio. You can see the light is quite good, and that's usually the first 2 weeks of August, and we work on heads for 4 or 5 days in a row. We work on the same head, and that's always a really enriching, fun time. So you can check out my website for those events, and I'll try to put a link in the description. I also have planes heads for sale on my website, so I'll try to put a link for that too. All right, see you next week.